Imagine walking into a room full of billionaires, where every handshake is worth millions, and in the middle of it all, a 12-year-old girl is mocked and laughed at just because of who she is. But seconds later, that laughter destroyed a $750 million empire. Tonight, you'll hear how arrogance collapsed the deal of a lifetime. Welcome to Brainfuel, the channel where real stories come alive. Stories of power, respect, and lessons that can change the way we see the world. If you love inspiring tales that mix drama with wisdom, you're in the right place. Sit back, relax, and let's dive into another story that will stay with you long after it ends. Everyone in the room stopped talking. That's how it began. A grand ballroom filled with billionaires, CEOs, and top investors suddenly froze in silence. Not because of a grand speech or some dramatic announcement, but because of the entrance of a young girl. The event was supposed to be the highlight of the year, a gala-style business meeting where one of the biggest corporate deals in recent history was about to be finalized. The Johnson Corporation, led by Ava Johnson, one of the most respected black female CEOs in the world, was about to join forces with the Whitmore family, an old-money dynasty worth billions. The deal was valued at $750 million. Everyone believed it was unbreakable. Crystal chandeliers glowed above, their light bouncing across polished marble floors. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried trays of champagne, and photographers clicked away, capturing every handshake and smile. A string quartet played softly in the background, adding to the atmosphere of wealth and sophistication. And then she appeared. A small figure stepped quietly into the hall. She wasn't dressed in diamonds, silk, or designer clothes like the others. She wore a simple pastel dress, her hair neatly tied back, and in her hand was not a phone or a handbag but a book, a children's novel she had been reading in the car. Her presence stood out immediately, not because she was loud or flashy, but because she was real in a room full of people trying too hard to look perfect. This was Maya Johnson, Ava's 12-year-old daughter. At first, a few heads turned casually, but soon whispers spread across the room. Some smiled politely, but others, particularly the Whitmore family, exchanged knowing looks. Their smirks were small at first, but quickly grew into laughter, the kind that wasn't hidden, the kind that cut deep. One of the Whitmore cousins leaned toward another and said under his breath, though loud enough for several to hear, "Seriously? She brought a child here? What is this, a family picnic?" Another chuckled, "Look at her dress. Doesn't she know this is a business deal, not a school play?" Their laughter echoed, and instead of stopping, it spread. Like wildfire, it moved from one smirk to another until a cluster of the billionaire family stood there, not even trying to hide their mockery. Maya felt it immediately. She wasn't naive. She knew the looks, the whispers, the pointing fingers. Her little hands gripped the book tighter, pressing it against her chest like a shield. Her face flushed and her steps slowed. But what hurt the most wasn't just the laughter. It was the way they looked at her. Not as a child, not even as a person. They looked at her as if she didn't belong. Ava noticed too. She was in the middle of greeting a group of investors when she saw the smirks directed at her daughter. Her smile faltered for just a moment, but then she straightened her shoulders, walked gracefully across the room, and placed her arm around Maya. Her touch was warm, steady, protective. "Sweetheart, you're right where you belong," Ava whispered into her ear. But the Whitmores didn't stop. Their patriarch, Richard Whitmore, the billionaire leading the deal, chuckled audibly and muttered to his wife, "Can you believe this? This is supposed to be a $750 million negotiation, and she treats it like a daycare." His wife smirked and shook her head, adding, "I guess some people just don't know what real class looks like." Maya heard that one. Her lips trembled, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she held her mother's hand tighter. She wanted to be strong, but the sting of those words went straight into her heart. Around them, silence spread again. Other guests shifted uncomfortably. Some stared at the floor, unwilling to get involved. Others watched closely, waiting to see how Ava would react. After all, she wasn't just any CEO. She was known for being fierce, intelligent, and unshakable. Would she risk the biggest deal of her life for the sake of her daughter's dignity? The moment stretched, heavy and suffocating. But then something unexpected happened. Maya, The little girl they were mocking stepped forward. She looked directly at the Whitmores, her chin raised, her eyes wet but steady. In a soft but clear voice, she asked, "Why does kindness cost you nothing, but you spend so much on being mean?" The room froze again. A child had just spoken the words that no adult dared to say. Her question wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic, but it landed heavier than any speech could have. For a second, even the Whitmores blinked in surprise. But arrogance dies hard. One of them scoffed. "Kids should be seen, not heard." Another chuckled. "What does she know about business?" But in that moment, Maya's words had already pierced through the facade. Guests glanced at one another. Some nodded subtly. Others whispered, "She's right." The tension in the room shifted. Ava knelt beside her daughter, brushed a tear from her cheek, and whispered, "You were brave, Maya. Don't ever let anyone take your voice away." Together, they turned and walked toward the negotiation table. But the room no longer felt the same. A line had been drawn. The mockery that was supposed to humiliate a child had instead revealed the ugliness of arrogance. And though the $750 million deal hadn't collapsed yet, the seeds of its destruction had already been planted. The deal was supposed to be straightforward. A $750 million merger. A celebration of two great companies coming together. But the night turned sour the moment the mocking began. The Whitmore family had always believed themselves untouchable. They were old money, dripping in generational wealth, walking into the room with an air of entitlement. Every movement, every smile, every word carried a kind of arrogance that money often brings when it goes unchecked. To them, this deal was already theirs. They believed Ava Johnson, despite her success, would bend over backward just for the chance to partner with them. And when Maya entered the room, they saw an opportunity, not to show kindness, but to assert their superiority. It started with a whisper from the Whitmore son, Ethan, a boy of 16. He was tall, dressed in an expensive tuxedo, but his smirk made him look small. He leaned toward his cousin and muttered just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Looks like someone brought charity to the party." His cousin snickered. The sound was sharp, cruel. It spread like a spark in dry grass. Within seconds, the Whitmore daughters were hiding their laughter behind jeweled hands. One of them even snapped a picture of Maya on her phone, whispering, "This will be hilarious to show later." And then came the words that would cut the deepest. Ethan's mother, seated beside Richard Whitmore, tilted her glass of champagne and said clearly, "I guess wealth doesn't buy class, does it?" Her tone was dripping with sarcasm, her voice loud enough for half the room to hear. The laughter that followed was like thunder in Maya's ears. Maya froze. She wasn't used to this kind of cruelty, not from strangers, not in front of so many people. Her chest tightened, her throat burned, and her small fingers clenched around the book she carried. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to run. But her feet wouldn't move. The room seemed to grow larger, the stares sharper, the whispers louder. Every laugh felt like a knife. Ava saw everything. She noticed how her daughter's shoulders shrank inward, how her lips trembled as though she was holding back tears. She noticed how some of the guests looked away, embarrassed, while others leaned in closer, eager to hear the next cruel comment. But Ava didn't move immediately. She wanted to see what her daughter would do. She wanted Maya to feel that she still had a choice, to shrink or to stand. And then it happened. Maya, barely 12 years old, straightened her back. She took one trembling step forward, looked directly at the Whitmores, and spoke in a voice so soft it forced the room into silence. "Why does kindness cost you nothing, but you spend so much on being mean?" It was a simple question, a child's question. But in that moment, it was more powerful than any speech a CEO could give. The room went still. Glasses froze midair. Forks hovered above plates. Every eye turned to the little girl who had dared to speak truth in a room full of billionaires. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably. They knew she was right. They had felt the cruelty. Too, they had seen the smirks, heard the whispers, but none of them had spoken up. It took a child to do what they were too afraid to do. For a brief second, even the Whitmores were caught off guard. Their laughter faltered. Their smiles slipped. But arrogance, when it is deeply rooted, is not easily shaken. Richard Whitmore, the patriarch himself, leaned back in his chair and let out a dismissive chuckle. "Kids these days," he said, waving his hand as though brushing away an insect. "Always too sensitive. This is business, not a kindergarten." His wife smirked, adding, "She'll learn someday. The world isn't about kindness. It's about power." The word struck like a slap. Maya's eyes welled with tears, but she stood her ground. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her question still hung in the air, echoing in the minds of everyone who had heard it. Ava moved then. She walked to her daughter's side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. She looked directly at the Whitmores, her expression calm, but her eyes burning with quiet fire. She didn't lash out, didn't shout, didn't create a scene. Instead, she whispered into Maya's ear, loud enough for those closest to hear. "You were brave, sweetheart. Never let anyone take your voice away." Maya nodded, her small hand gripping her mother's tightly. Around the room, the atmosphere shifted. Investors who had been laughing moments earlier now looked uneasy. A few shook their heads at the Whitmores' behavior. Some whispered among themselves, questioning whether they were witnessing a partnership or humiliation. But the Whitmores didn't care. They believed themselves too powerful to be challenged. They leaned back in their chairs, sipping champagne, smirking as though nothing had happened. What they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that in mocking a child, they hadn't just embarrassed Ava Johnson's daughter. They had planted the seeds of their own downfall. The whispers of laughter that had begun as entertainment were now being remembered as cruelty. The investors watching were quietly taking mental notes. And Ava Johnson, the woman they thought would never risk the deal, was silently making a decision that would soon shock them all. In that single moment, between a child's question and a billionaire's arrogance, the future of a $750 million deal began to unravel. The Whitmores thought they were mocking weakness, but in truth, they had revealed their own. And when the collapse came, it would be fast, brutal, and unforgettable. Ava Johnson had built her empire on one unshakable principle: respect. It didn't matter if she was negotiating million-dollar contracts, meeting factory workers, or speaking to janitor. Respect was non-negotiable. And tonight, as she sat across from the Whitmore family, she realized that the most expensive lesson of their lives was about to begin. The negotiation table gleamed under the ballroom lights. Papers neatly stacked, pens lined up, contracts waiting for signatures. For everyone else in the room, this was the climax of months of preparation. But for Ava, the deal no longer looked golden. It looked poisoned. She glanced at her daughter, Maya, sitting quietly beside her. The little girl's eyes were still red from holding back tears, but her chin was lifted, her small shoulders squared with courage. That sight alone gave Ava clarity. She knew she couldn't let this pass. Not for money, not for status, not even for the promise of expanding her company to new markets. If she signed this deal after watching her daughter be humiliated, what lesson would Maya learn? That money was worth more than dignity? That silence was safer than courage? No. Ava had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, and endured too many storms to let her daughter inherit fear disguised as compromise. The room was buzzing with anticipation. The investors leaned forward, pens ready, phones out to capture the historic signing. Richard Whitmore, smug as ever, adjusted his tie and smirked at Ava. To him, the insults from earlier were nothing more than harmless banter. He believed Ava would never walk away. He believed the $750 million dangling in front of her would silence any pride. "Shall we proceed?" Richard said, sliding the contract across the table with a confident smile. His diamond-studded cufflinks caught the light as if to remind everyone of his wealth. Ava didn't touch the papers. Instead, she looked straight into Richard's eyes. Her calmness unsettled him, though he didn't show it. She spoke softly, but her voice carried enough weight to hush the entire ballroom. "I was about to sign this partnership," she began, her hand resting gently on Maya's shoulder. "But if this is how your family treats my daughter in public, I can only imagine how you'll treat my company behind closed doors." The room stiffened. Investors looked up, startled. The quartet in the corner even stopped playing for a moment. Ava's words didn't sound like negotiation. They sounded like judgment. Richard leaned back in his chair and laughed, dismissing her words as if they were a joke. "Oh, come on," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Don't be dramatic. Kids don't matter here. Business is business." That one sentence hit the air like a crack of thunder. The guests gasped. Some exchanged nervous glances. Others pressed their lips together, unwilling to show reaction. But Ava simply smiled. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It wasn't even a polite smile. It was the kind of smile that comes when a person knows they hold all the cards while their opponent doesn't even realize the game has changed. Slowly, deliberately, Ava closed the folder containing the contract. The sound echoed across the silent room, sharp as a gavel in a courtroom. She didn't push it forward. She didn't sign. She simply folded her hands on top of it and let the silence grow heavy. Richard's smirk faltered. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice suddenly less confident. Ava stood, her elegant gown flowing around her like armor. She placed a steady hand on Maya's back and helped her rise as well. Then, with her eyes fixed on Richard, she said words that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Business is always personal, and you just lost mine." The silence was so thick it felt like the air had been drained from a room. Investors leaned back in shock, their pens lowering slowly. Photographers froze, unsure whether to capture this unexpected twist. Richard's wife scoffed. "Try to regain control of the narrative. Don't be ridiculous, Ava. This is a $750 million opportunity. You're not going to throw that away over a child's feelings." Ava's gaze hardened. "That child is my daughter, and she will grow up knowing that her worth is not measured in millions, but in respect. If you can't offer her that, then you have nothing I want." Maya looked up at her mother in awe. For the first time that evening, her lips curled into a small, proud smile. She felt safe again. Seen again. Her mother had chosen her over money, and that meant everything. Richard's face turned red. He leaned forward, his voice rising. "Do you realize what you're walking away from? Do you realize how many companies would beg for this deal?" Ava didn't flinch. "Let them beg." "I don't." Gasps rippled through the room. The Whitmores were not used to being refused, especially not in public. Their empire had been built on intimidation, on the assumption that no one would dare say no. But here, in front of hundreds of witnesses, a woman they had mocked and underestimated was not only saying no, she was doing it with calm, unshakable power. Richard slammed his hand on the table, the papers rustling. "This is madness." But Ava remained composed. She turned to the investors seated nearby and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, let this be a reminder. Respect is not a weakness in business. It is the foundation of it. Without it, no contract is worth signing." Her words struck like arrows. Several investors nodded slowly, their expressions shifting from shock to admiration. They weren't just witnessing the collapse of a deal. They were witnessing the rise of a leader who valued dignity over dollars. As Ava took Maya's hand and began to walk away from the table, Richard called after her, desperate now, "You will regret this, Johnson. Nobody walks away from the Whitmores." But Ava didn't look back. She didn't need to. The truth was already written in the stunned silence of the crowd. The arrogance that had fueled the Whitmores moments ago was now crumbling into desperation. The deal, once thought unbreakable, was dead, not because of numbers, not because of contracts, but because of arrogance. And as the sound of Ava's heels clicked against the marble floor, every person in the room knew they had just witnessed history. The night when a $750 million deal collapsed in seconds, all because one family thought mocking a child was harmless. They were wrong. The ballroom buzzed with disbelief. Ava Johnson had just walked away from a $750 million deal in front of some of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world. No one could believe it. Deals like this weren't supposed to collapse. Not in public, not in front of investors, and certainly not because of pride. But Ava knew better. To her, this wasn't pride, it was principle. As she and Maya stepped away from the negotiation table, whispers rose like a storm behind them. "Did she really just walk away?" one man muttered. "She must be insane," another whispered. But beneath the shock, There was also a spark of admiration. Some investors, quietly watching, recognized courage when they saw it. Richard Whitmore, still seated at the table, clenched his fists. His face was pale with fury. His entire life, people had bent over backward to please him. No one ever told him no, especially not in front of an audience. Especially not a woman he had spent weeks dismissing as lucky rather than brilliant. "Don't worry," he muttered to his family, trying to mask his panic. "She'll come back. She has to. No one walks away from this kind of money." But Ava didn't look back. And then her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it, but something told her to check. She glanced at the screen and a slow, knowing smile spread across her face. It was a message from the CEO of Kingsley Global, one of the Whitmore's fiercest rivals. The message was short but powerful. "Saw what happened. Respect wins. We're ready to talk. $1.5 billion on the table. Tonight." Ava's eyes softened as she turned to Maya. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "sometimes walking away isn't the end. It's the beginning." She tucked her phone away, but investors nearby had already noticed a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. Whispers grew louder. What if she has another deal lined up? Who's backing her? Is she bluffing? Richard, watching her closely, noticed too. His confidence faltered. For the first time that evening, doubt crept into his face. Meanwhile, Maya looked up at her mother with innocent curiosity. "Mom, what happened?" Ava knelt beside her daughter, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "When people show you who they are," she said gently, "you believe them, and you never build your future with people who don't respect you." Maya nodded slowly, tried to absorb her mother's wisdom. She didn't understand all the details, but she understood one thing. Her mother had chosen her over money. That truth gave her more strength than anything else. As Ava guided Maya toward the exit, murmurs followed them. Guests were torn between disbelief and awe. Some admired Ava's strength. Others whispered that she was reckless. But all of them knew they had just witnessed something historic. Then Ava paused. She turned back, not to Richard, but to the room full of investors and executives. Her voice was calm, yet it carried through the ballroom like a bell. "Ladies and gentlemen, remember this. Money without respect is a ticking time bomb. You may not hear it now, but one day it explodes. Tonight, I choose respect. And that choice will never bankrupt me." The words struck deep. Some nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard tried to laugh it off, but no one was laughing with him anymore. And then the news began to spread, first through murmurs, then through phone screens. Within minutes, it reached the very people Richard feared most, his shareholders. Messages pinged across the room as investors checked their phones, their eyes widening. Reports were already circulating that Kingsley Global, Richard's greatest competitor, was about to close a massive deal with Ava Johnson. The timing couldn't have been worse, for Richard, at least. He stood abruptly, his voice desperate now. "This is nonsense. She's bluffing. She has nothing." But no one believed him. His arrogance, once seen as confidence, now looked like denial. His family sat frozen, their smirks wiped clean. For the first time in decades, the Whitmores weren't in control. Meanwhile, Ava's phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't just Kingsley Global. It was two other international firms, both eager to meet. Her bold stand had transformed her into the most sought-after partner in the room. Ava turned to Maya, kneeling again so she was eye level with her daughter. "Do you see what happened?" she asked softly. "They tried to make us feel small, but all it did was show the world how small they are." Maya smiled for the first time that night. "So we won." Ava chuckled. "Respect is always a win, sweetheart. And sometimes when you choose it, the world rewards you in ways money alone never could." Behind them, Richard was unraveling. He barked orders at his assistants, demanding phones, demanding calls. But it was too late. The tide had turned. Investors were leaving his side, drifting toward Ava, eager to shake her hand. The ballroom that once belonged to the Whitmores now belonged to Ava Johnson. As mother and daughter walked toward the exit, camera flashes lit up the room. Reporters had caught everything. The mocking, the refusal, the collapse. By morning, the story would be everywhere. The Whitmores, once untouchable, would be the face of arrogance, and Ava Johnson would be celebrated as the woman who chose respect over riches, and ended up richer than anyone expected. The power shift had happened, and no amount of money, no frantic apology, no desperate call could undo it. Because in a single night, a mother's courage and a child's question had brought down the arrogance of the billionaire family and built something far greater in its place. By the time Ava and Maya stepped out of the ballroom that night, the world was already watching. It had only been minutes since the confrontation. But in the age of smartphones and social media, minutes were enough to change everything. Guests had filmed the Whitmores' mocking words, Maya's brave response, and Ava's decision to walk away. The clips spread like wildfire. By the time Ava's car pulled up the hotel entrance, hashtags like hashtag respect over riches and hashtag 750 million collapse were already trending. Inside the ballroom, Richard Whitmore was spiraling. His voice echoed as he barked orders at his assistants, demanding statements, demanding silence, demanding control. But control was gone. The narrative was no longer his to write. It belonged to thousands of voices now rising online, replaying his arrogance for the world to judge. Meanwhile, Ava sat quietly in the back of her car, Maya nestled against her side. The little girl leaned her head on her mother's shoulder and whispered, "Mom, did I make things worse?" Ava kissed her daughter's forehead and smiled softly. "No, sweetheart, you made everything right. You spoke the truth, and sometimes the truth shakes the world." Maya's eyes glowed with pride. For the first time that evening, she no longer felt small. She no longer felt like the child who didn't belong. She felt powerful because her voice had mattered. That night, news stations picked up the story. Headlines blazed across screens. $750 million deal collapses after billionaire family publicly mocks black CEO's daughter. Child simple question shakes billionaire dynasty. Ava Johnson walks away from deal, gains respect the world. The footage of Maya's trembling but courageous words. "Why does kindness cost you nothing, but you spend so much on being mean?" circulated everywhere. Millions watched it on repeat. Parents shared it with their children. Business leaders quoted it in speeches. Within 24 hours, it had become a global anthem for dignity and respect. The Whitmores, once hailed as untouchable, found themselves drowning in backlash. Their stock value plummeted as investors pulled out in droves. Major partners canceled contracts. Shareholders demanded answers. Richard tried to hold press conferences, insisting it was a misunderstanding. But the videos told the truth better than any excuse ever could. Their empire began to crumble, not because of numbers, but because of arrogance. On the other hand, Ava Johnson's star rose higher than ever before. Kingsley Global finalized their $1.5 billion offer, and other corporations followed with even larger proposals. What the Whitmores had mocked as weakness, the world now celebrated as strength. Her decision to walk away wasn't seen as reckless. It was seen as revolutionary. But for Ava, the money wasn't the victory. The real victory happened in the quiet moments. The morning after, as sunlight poured into their penthouse suite, Maya sat by the window, holding her book. Her eyes were bright, her smile genuine. She turned to her mother and asked, "Mom, are people still talking about what I said?" Ava nodded, pouring them both a cup of tea. "Yes, sweetheart. They're talking about it everywhere." Maya looked down shyly. "I didn't mean to be brave. I just didn't understand why they were so mean." Ava knelt beside her daughter, holding her hands. "That's the thing, Maya. Sometimes the questions we ask in innocence are the ones that show the world its flaws. You didn't just speak for yourself last night. You spoke for everyone who has ever been laughed at, mocked, or told they don't belong. That's why people are listening." Maya's smile grew, and for the first time she realized that her voice carried power far beyond what she imagined. As days turned into weeks, the story refused to fade. Ava was invited to speak at global conferences. She appeared on magazine covers, hailed not just as a CEO, but as a leader with integrity. Maya's question was printed on posters, quoted in classrooms, and even painted on murals in cities across the world. And the Whitmores? They became the cautionary tale. Where they once inspired envy, they now inspired pity. Their arrogance had cost them not only $750 million, but also their legacy. People no longer wanted to associate with their name. They were remembered not for their wealth, but for the night they laughed at a child and lost everything. One evening, as Ava tucked Maya into bed, the little girl asked, "Do you think they're sorry?" Ava thought for a moment, then answered, "Maybe, but whether they are or not doesn't matter. What matters is that we stood up for ourselves, and we showed the world that respect is worth more than money." Maya hugged her mother tightly. "I want to remember that forever." Ava kissed her cheek. "You will, because it's not just a lesson for tonight. It's a lesson for life." And so, the story of one evening in a glittering ballroom became more than just gossip. It became a parable, a modern-day reminder that money can buy luxury, but it cannot buy decency. It showed the world that arrogance is fragile and respect is unbreakable. For the Whitmores, the collapse of the deal marked the beginning of their downfall. For Ava and Maya, it marked the start of something far greater. The world would not remember the contract that wasn't signed. It would not remember the dollar figures or the market shares. What the world would remember was a little girl's question, a question that silenced a room full of billionaires and reminded humanity of a truth too often forgotten. Kindness costs nothing, but arrogance can cost you everything.